Today, I want to challenge you to rethink church. If you're an American Christian, this is probably how church works for you. You get up, you go to a building, you listen to a sermon, you sort of check it off your box, and then you go home and we'll do it again. It's kind of like, for a lot of people, it's kind of like going to a movie. You're consuming a product, right? The product is a sermon, and Christians today, they go to consume a product. And so if they don't like the product, they go find another church, a church where they like the product a little bit better. It's kind of like going to a movie. You go to a movie, I do this with my wife. I go to a movie, we talk about whether we like the movie or not on the way home, and that's it. It doesn't really impact our lives. That's pretty much what it boils down to. And for so many Christians today, now I know this isn't true for everybody, but for so many Christians today, that's what church boils down to, is listening to a sermon. But I want to challenge you today that is not what Jesus envisioned. Jesus envisioned that church would be more than a sermon. Now, I'm not trying to throw sermons under the bus. I preach for a living, so I think it's great that we have good teachers, biblical teachers. That's all great. But what I want to challenge you to consider is that church is more than that, and that's what Jesus thought too. Jesus envisioned a church that actually makes a difference in the world. That's what he wanted. After all, church is not a building. That's what we think about. Church is a people. So if you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, you're a part of his church, and he envisioned that you would make a difference in the world. And I think Matthew chapter 9 is a perfect example of this. In Matthew 9, earlier in the chapter, Jesus is out there preaching a sermon to the crowds. So it probably looks a lot like a megachurch, right? We've got crowds gathered to hear a great teacher. And Jesus was, of course, the greatest teacher. He preaches the sermon, and then he says this. In verse 36, it says that when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few." And here's what I think Jesus was experiencing at that moment 2,000 years ago, because I've experienced this so many times as a preacher. I've been up there, I've preached a sermon. Sometimes I could see that it hit this person over here or this person over here. I see tears in somebody's eyes, and I can tell that this sermon is impacting them. And maybe that's exactly how Jesus felt. He preaches this sermon, and he can see thousands of people, and he can tell that the sermon has impacted them. But then in his heart, he had compassion on those people because he understood that the sermon wouldn't be enough for them. As great as the sermon was, that the sermon wouldn't be enough for them. There have been many times where I've preached a sermon, and afterward I feel kind of empty because I know that people are going to walk away from there having heard a sermon and needing something a little bit more. Because, be honest, sermons can go in one ear and out the other. Or maybe you've been sitting there listening to a message and it's really impacted you, but by the time you finish up with lunch later on in the afternoon, you've already forgotten about the sermon. Or Monday morning comes along and now you're back to the grind and you forget about the sermon. And so the reality is Jesus envisioned something more than just people coming to church, checking the box, listening to a sermon, going home, coming back next week. It's not supposed to just be all about one pastor, one teacher giving a sermon, and everyone watches that person do ministry.